It is a big pleasure to be here today in Bangkok in this World Congress, and I'm going to talk about our experience with mutual recovery. First, a word about our learning objectives. We are trying to identify the main changes in the paradigm in psychosocial rehabilitation for people diagnosed with severe mental illness. This is something that's been going on for many years now, and we are in a very important turning point in psychiatry for many reasons, but certainly the pandemic was a terrible pain for many people, lots of suffering around the world, but it also opened lots of new opportunities and ways to change and think about what we do and how we understand our patients in a different way. I will explain the model of accompanied autoanalysis, which we later called accompanied self-rehabilitation, sharing the experience with mutual recovery during COVID-19 pandemic. And as I was mentioning, I will try to show and discuss all the good things that came with the pandemic. That is, of course, if we are able to learn from past experiences and we don't forget all the important lessons we received during all this very complicated period. We will explain how mutual recovery and changes in lifestyles are nowadays for us the crucial tools in the processes of psychosocial rehabilitation. We've moved from different ideas until we came to this when we began many years ago just questioning the idea of the expert and the patient, trying to understand that the big role we had as therapists was basically to accompany those people who are suffering from so-called mental illness. But we gradually arrived to this conclusion, which I can kind of state it from the beginning, that nowadays the mutual recovery and changes in lifestyle, both in the so-called therapist and the so-called patient, are the most important thing we have. In this new paradigm, as we say, the human being called the therapist, who also struggles with his internal world, accompanies another human being called the accompanied person, in which both develop and change in a mutual recovery approach. We have arrived to a situation in which, as you see, we're very careful with language, and we do using the same word as people or person, both to describe both the therapist, the old therapist in old times, and the patient, as we call them in the old times. And none of the two can change and recover without the other undergoing the same process. As we will try to show, the only way that we can achieve our change in our clients, in the accompanied person, is if we are willing to change ourselves. If we don't change, the other party will not change. And also, of course, why not? The other person will not change if we don't change. So all this was based in our what we called and what we developed as accompanied. First, we called it accompanied autoanalysis, and later accompanied self-rehabilitation. And there are really four big principles in this approach. It's a process. We should see this four ideas as a process. We began many years ago, and we still do, by acknowledging all that we ignore, that we ignore about what mental health is, about how the mind works, the brain works. This is the main starting point, to acknowledge that we ignore most things. And that's something that is quite linked to science as a whole, because science really shows us in a much clearer way, all that we don't know more than we do know. It has always been a big question for us to understand why it is that when we are in a scientific setting, we accept that we don't really know what the mental illness is, what the words we were using until recently, like schizophrenia and words like that. We didn't really know what schizophrenia was. But once we are in front of another person who has had that diagnosis, we seem to suddenly, magically know what it is. And we tell the person, look, you have an illness called schizophrenia. It's something that you'll have for life. There's no cure for that. So it always struck us a lot. How did this happen? Moving from acknowledging all that we ignore in a scientific setting, and then suddenly knowing everything when we're in front of another person. If we acknowledge ignorance, then we arrive to the second step in the process, which is assuming that the person who has the suffering, whatever it is, has to assume the full leadership of his process of recovery. He or she has to be the leader. If the other person, the so-called expert, acknowledges that he doesn't know, it means that the leadership has to be assumed by the person who's suffering whatever situation we're talking about. And that means that from then on, the leadership of the process of recovery has really to be in the hands of the person who is in that process. The third moment in the process is a moment in which the person has to become an expert in himself and in his so-called illness. An expert in the smallest details of everyday life. It's not an expertise that's related. It's also related. I mean, if the person has that, it's more than welcome. Let's say that a person has been able to have a deep psychodynamic psychotherapy or psychoanalysis where he knows a lot about his inner life. That's great. But it's not necessary that the person has that sort of expertise. Here we're talking about a person knowing what are the settings, the lifestyles, mainly what is the lifestyle where the person is able to live, to think, to behave, and to feel in the best possible way, and to be himself, to develop himself as a human being as far as possible. And then there's a fourth moment in the process of what we call accompanied self-rehabilitation, which is a moment in which the person has to redesign his lifestyle according to his expertise, thanks to the fact that he's now the leader of his own process, and acknowledging again and again all that he continues to ignore, because this is a kind of a never-ending process that moves permanently within these four moments of that we have been describing. And in this sense, the pandemic really moved us in the right direction. The pandemic forced everybody worldwide to change their lifestyles. And that is something that allowed people to understand how important lifestyle is, how powerful a lifestyle is in both extremes. Certain lifestyles can move you and can harm you a lot and can move you into very difficult emotional states. And also certain lifestyles can allow you to develop as a human being in the best possible way. The pandemic also showed us how important it is for us to really have a sense of community, of belonging, and a real attitude of reciprocity and mutuality. So all these ideas that we are beginning to encourage after many years, to accept that what happens in any therapeutic process, in any psychotherapy, is a mutual recovery. That's happened thanks to the pandemic. The pandemic allowed this to move in the right direction. We became conscious of the enormous impact of human interactions. We understood with the pandemic that either the only way to overcome the pandemic was to really do it together. So all this created an atmosphere that promoted change, both in the so-called patient and in therapists. Since we began to work many years ago with people with a diagnosis of severe psychosis and severe mental illness, were people who were forced to certain lifestyles. That was a common denominator that we saw continuously in people who ended up having emotional and very difficult emotional conditions. And they were forced sometimes by others and sometimes by themselves. And very soon in our process, we realized, and people realized, how sometimes the only way not to go really mad is to really look like a mad person, because you are able and you have kind of internal permission to really develop as a human being. So this idea and this possibility of centering mutual recovery and changes in lifestyle, as we mentioned in the beginning, this is the main reason I've tried to explain which are the main kind of situations and conditions that allowed us to arrive to this conclusion that mutual recovery and changes in lifestyle are currently the most important tools in our process of mutual recovery. Thank you very much.